Well, good evening, brothers and sisters, and welcome to our Wednesday evening class tonight. Our brother Marty will continue his Daniel classes, and we're looking forward to that. We'll just commence with a word of prayer. If you all rise, please. Great Almighty Heavenly Father, Thou who dwells in the heavens above, we recognize your power and your greatness, and indeed we recognize your hand working the nations as well. Great God, we see that you can control things in this earth, and we wonder at the things that are happening right now. And we know you are also working in our own lives. We're thankful for the blessings that you have given us every day. We're thankful for the opportunity now to sit down and meet around your word. We're thankful that we have each other in this place to meet as well. So we ask for your blessings this evening. We might be able to have a clear mind, ready to concentrate, to listen and to learn, that we might be able to be uplifted and to understand your principles this night. So, great God, as we ask for your care throughout this night, we also pray that you might care for those who are not with us at this time, both in our ecclesia and at other ecclesias across the world. May we uplift those who we can, and we ask for your help in doing so. So, great God, we now leave this meeting in your hand, coming to thee through your Son's name, Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Brother Marty's asked that we read from Daniel chapter 11 to introduce his class this evening. And so we'll read from Daniel 11, and we'll start at verse 30 through to the end of the chapter. Daniel 11, commencing at verse 30. For the ships of Chittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return, and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return, and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. And such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploit. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword, and by flame, by captivity, and by spoil many days. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, and to purge, and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself, and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of woman, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver, and with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. And he shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury, to destroy and utterly to make away many. And he shall plant the tabernacle of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. So we'll invite our brother Marty forward this evening.
Well, thanks, Brother Luke, and good evening, dear brethren and sisters, and also to all those joining us online. Well, we continue through this rather lengthy chapter of Daniel, and you know, there comes a time when we're called upon to make decisions for truth or otherwise, truth or compromise, and they are some of the things that will come upon the people of Israel. Now, just a reminder, it's been a little while since our last class. Perhaps I can ask whether anybody can remember. There is a key verse that helps us understand what the overall structure of Daniel 11 is about, what the focus of Daniel 11 is, but it's not in Daniel 11. Who can remember that? Just remembering, of course, that Daniel 10, 11 and 12 are one continuous vision, one continuous prophecy and vision. Well, it's back in chapter 10, isn't it? Chapter 10 and verse 14, when the angel says to Daniel, he says, "Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days. For yet the vision is for many days." And that's our key, isn't it? What will happen, Daniel, to thy people, the people of Israel, in the latter days? And so their whole, as it were, history, how they're being affected by the world empires is unfolded for them in Daniel chapter 11. And if I turn this on, it'll probably make things work better. Remember our analysis. For some reason, I've got the projector full size, but the picture's not quite. Just that a little bit bigger. Refocus it. Okay, as good as it'll get for now. Okay, so this was the overall analysis, wasn't it, of Daniel 11? You've seen this slide numerous times. Verse 1 and 2, the Persian rule imposed. Verse 3 to 4, Alexander the Great and his successors, and how that there was, first of all, the king of the south, the Ptolemies ruled, then the Seleucids, and coming down, and we considered in our last class Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, and his pressure that he put upon the nation. So just stepping back through that now in the historical sense, after the death of Alexander the Great, his empire was divided into four, two of which we recall became the king of the north and the king of the south. Okay, the Ptolemies here in the south and the Seleucids in the north, because of course their relation to the nation of Israel. And this is what this vision is about. What's going to befall Daniel's people in the latter days? And then it focuses in on, and we read quite a bit about the battles between the king of the north and the king of the south. And there was at least 6 of them. And we have them listed here. I'm not going to go through them particularly. But the key was this. Initially, the land was controlled by the king of the south, the Ptolemies, until the time of Antiochus III. And by the way, the Ptolemies pushed right up as far as, well, Ptolemais, that you have up in the north of, in what is today Lebanon. Ptolemais. They went right up, in fact, further than that, pushing against the king of the north. But eventually, under Antiochus III, he came down and he was victorious. 198 BC, and the control of the land changed from the king of the south to the king of the north. And so we have it here, okay, at this time. So here's the control of the land. Persian, and there's Alexander the Great, and for another little time, there was Antigonus in there, and then controlled from Egypt, then controlled from the king of the north. And we're coming now to this section here tonight. In fact, this blue and purple we hope to get through tonight. As what's unfolding and occurring to the people of Israel. Now let's remind ourselves about Antiochus Epiphanes. His father Antiochus III had established control over the land of Israel. He had some concerns though. His father had been humbled by the Romans. He'd gone west towards Greece to fight against the Romans, and he'd been humbled and sent back basically home with his tail between his leg, and then he didn't make it home. So Antiochus IV then pursued a policy of a united Hellenistic religion for all people under his rule. He thought the way to consolidate his kingdom was have everybody on the same religion. We want to all be singing out of the same hymn book, so as to speak. He pushed into Egypt to control the Ptolemaic kingdom, and remember he got there, but he was thwarted at the end by the decree of the Roman Senate. And then he came back, grieved as we have him in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 30. He's grieved and he comes and has indignation against the Holy Covenant and seeks to have intelligence with those that forsake it. And the Holy Covenant, of course, is to do with the worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem. And so the control of the land is about to change from the time of Antiochus IV. But there is a struggle for that. And we recall this famous woodcut drawing, it's not a photograph, of the intervention of the Romans, and where we get our term to draw a line in the sand, because that's literally what they did. Here's Antiochus. He got right over to here. He was going to take Alexandria, and the Romans turned up and he was known to Antiochus because Antiochus IV had spent some time in Rome. He came and he drew a circle around him and said, are you going to go home or not? You need to make your decision before you step out the line. And from which we get, he drew a line in the sand and he went home. And we have how he felt in verse 30. See, the ships of Kittim, who were bearing the Roman consul, shall come against him, that's Antiochus IV. Therefore he shall be grieved and return. So he returned out of Egypt and have indignation against the Holy Covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. You know, and this isn't the first time. Back in verse 28, his heart had been against the Holy Covenant. He was grieved by these Jews, and it was getting at him, and he saw that he wanted one religion for all of his territory, which, by the way, extended right over into Parthia, Persia, and that was his control. And he wanted a united religion. He didn't want this religion here and that religion somewhere else. He wanted to unite the kingdom. And he finds fertile ground in Israel for his policy. Because what we find is division among the Jews in those days. There were some who said, well, why don't we just become like the Greeks? Why don't we have their religion? You know, it's easy to go along with, and that's these people here who we see in the orange. But there was a struggle by those who wanted to maintain the worship of the God of Israel. And this is from Josephus. Now, as the former high priest Jesus, or Jason, had raised a sedition against Menelaus, by the way, he was a priest that had been installed by Antiochus, who was ordained after him, the multitude divided between them both. Okay, and so there was a struggle between them. Between the laws of the country, or the laws of the nation of Israel, and the king's laws and the Grecian way of living. We talked about that in our last class. The way that Grecian influence impacted upon the nation. The worship, the way of life, even down to the issue of circumcision. And in the book of Maccabees, which of course we have, if you get onto eSword and you look in the King James Version with the Apocrypha, you can find the book of Maccabees there. They're not part of the canon of Scripture, but they are historical writings. And they tell us somewhat about that time. And they talk about it, King Antiochus, who writes to his whole kingdom, and everyone should leave his laws. And some of the Israelites, many of them, consented to his religion. And they polluted the sanctuary and the holy place. They set up altars, groves, and chapels of idols, and they would leave their children uncircumcised. That is how it was impacting upon the nation of Israel. And it impacted even to the high priest. And he was very grieved with that nation. And so in verse 30 and 31, we find that he was grieved with them, he had intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant, and then arms shall stand on his part. In other words, he had people doing his work, and they would pollute the sanctuary of strength, particularly a general that he had whose name was Apollonius. And they shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. And this was what was going to foment the Maccabee rebellion, and which we're going to have a look at, because they just couldn't stomach it anymore. The worship was taken away out of the temple. There was a altar there established to the gods of the Greeks, and that was the abomination then that made desolate or astonished, as we have. So they were just astonished and stunned by this change that had happened right in the precincts of the temple. We recall that there was a time period that was coming to an end, wasn't it? Just come with me to Ezekiel chapter 4. We didn't turn it up last time. Let's have a look at Ezekiel chapter 4. And in Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 4 to 6, Ezekiel, he's a man of sign, and he has to depict things by things that he does. And in this case, he's told, verse 4, he says, "Lie thou also upon thy left side, and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it, to the number of the days that thou shalt lie upon it to bear their iniquity. For I have laid upon thee the years of their iniquity, according to the number of the days, 390 days, so shalt thou bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. And when thou hast accomplished them, lie again on the right side, and thou shalt bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have appointed thee each day for a year." So from the time Solomon through to this time was about 430 years, or was coming to the end of 430 years. The iniquity of the house of Israel. And God said, "Ezekiel, by sign, you're going to lay prostrate before the nations." Typical of what's going to happen to Israel for 430 years. Now, when Ezekiel did this, it was just a little time after BC 605. BC 605 was the time that Daniel was taken into captivity. Ezekiel a little after. And what we find is for 430 years, the nation of Israel are prostrate. They're humbled before the nations. Babylon, Persia, Greece, okay? They got no self-determination. They got someone putting pressure on them. But that 430 years is coming to an end now. And you'll notice a little thing in verse 27, back in Daniel 11. Okay, at the end of verse 27, it says, "It shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed." So there's an appointed time, but what it's saying is not yet. But when you get to verse 29, it's the time appointed. Our 430 years is running out, and things begin to change. And so the sanctuary of strength in verse 31 is polluted. And in verse 32, "Such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he," that is Antiochus Epiphanes, "corrupt by flatteries. So some capitulate, some collaborate with the Greeks, with the Hellenizing Greeks and the Hellenistic Jews. And the idea of the word flattery, by the way, is this: it comes from a word to be smooth. So there's smooth speaking, isn't it? And that's how Antiochus Epiphanes operated. In fact, he came into his kingdom by flatteries in the end of verse 21. And so he's now going to enforce the Greek religion. He's going to enforce it upon people. And he appoints a man by the name of Athenaeus. He's an elderly man. He's very well versed in the Greek religion and in idolatry. And his task was to carry out the edict of Antiochus, forcing people to sacrifice to idols on the king's birthday. You know, they probably had a long weekend. Commanding the Jews to offer swine's flesh on the altar in the temple. Dedicating the temple to Jupiter Olympus. And on the altar, he built another altar to be used to sacrifice to idols. And they forbade the circumcision of their children. Now that's like the government now telling us, oh, you can no longer baptise your children. They cannot be brought into covenant with God. That was the impact. And yet it was a persuasive culture of the flesh, wasn't it? And there were some who went along with it. But in verse 32, there is a people who know their God. They shall be strong and do exploits. So at this time of stark choice, follow the Greeks or follow the laws of their God, many capitulated, but some didn't. The people who do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And so the Maccabees were to rise up. Now they were a national party of the nation of the Jews. And as we mentioned in our last class, the name Maccabee, you'll find a similar word, Maccabah, in Jeremiah, and it's the word for hammer. And so Judas Maccabeus, Judas the hammer, because that was what he was going to do to the Greeks. Their family name is the Asmoneans. Let me bring up this chart here. So here's Judas, the Maccabeans or the Hasmoneans, because they come from Hashmon. And then his son was Mattathias. And we're going to talk about Mattathias in a minute. He was an aged priest. He lived at Modin, which is a city that's just a little to the west of Jerusalem. And he became the leader initially of this party. And the Greeks tried to violently suppress it. And the outcome was that eventually the shackles of Greek power were thrown off and they re-established Judah under their own self-determination. The book of Maccabees records for us the beginning of the revolt. And it tells us the story. So the officers of the king in charge of enforcing the apostasy, in other words, Greek religion, came to the city of Modin to make them sacrifice. I have a map which will show where that is shortly, but it's just a few miles to the northwest of Jerusalem. Many of Israel joined them, but Mattathias, the son of Hashmon, and his sons drew together. Then the officers of the king addressed Mattathias, "You are a leader, an honourable and great man in this city, supported by sons and kindreds. Come now and be the first to obey the king's command, as all the Gentiles and Judeans and those that are left in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons shall be numbered among the king's friends, and you and your sons shall be honoured with silver and gold and many gifts." Flatteries. Smooth talking, isn't it? You know, you're a leader in your village. You just come and make the sacrifice, because they would know that if the leader in the village made the sacrifice, he's a priest, well, it's all right for others to follow along. Mattathias was determined that that was not going to be the case. And he says, although all the Gentiles on the king's realm obey him, so they that forsake the religion of their ancestors and consent to the king's orders, yet I and my sons and my kindred will keep the covenant of our ancestors. Heaven forbid that we should forsake the law and the commandments. By the way, the Apostle Paul used an expression that sounds a little bit similar to that, doesn't it? By no means. We have it in God forbid, but it's actually by no means. We will not obey the words of the king by departing from our religion to the slightest degree. And so there's all these people around an altar. There's the representatives of Antiochus Epiphanes there. And there's tension. What's going to happen? Mattathias has refused to offer, and the whole village is gathered. They've been gathered. Well, someone from the crowd says, well, I'll make the offering. A Jew stepped forward. Mattathias saw red, and he slaughtered him, and it started the revolt. He slaughtered, by the way, the king's representative as well, and it's recorded for us. Okay, he was inflamed with zeal. So one of the Jews came forward to offer the sacrifice. Mattathias is inflamed with zeal, and he ran and slew him upon the altar. And also the king's commissioner, who Josephus was told us was named Apelles, who compelled the men to sacrifice, was killed at that time. The altar pulled down, and thus dealt he zealously for the law of God, like as Phinehas unto Zambri the son of Salem. Of course, that's a reference back to the time of Phinehas the priest, who stopped the plague by his decisive action against the apostasy at that time. That was the beginning of the revolt around BC 167. And here it is, and it starts here in Modin. So here's Jerusalem, here's the Dead Sea, it's just over here. And it starts. And those that gathered with him fled to the hills of Gophna. They hid away and become like a terrorist group, a guerrilla group. Not a terrorist group, a guerrilla group, where they would attack and retreat and attack and retreat against the Greeks. Now, Mattathias, being an elderly man, he didn't actually last that much longer. Probably the privations of being out, camping out all the time, and the pressure, and he died in 166 BC. But on his deathbed, he commissioned his sons to continue the struggle, and it was to be led by Judas, one of his sons. Now, this is where sometimes always God's timetable comes together, but you can sometimes look at it and go, wow, look at that. Because at the same time, there was problems in the east, way over in the east in Parthia. King Mithridates of Parthia rebelled against Antiochus IV. And Antiochus IV had to head east to put down the rebellion. And that was somewhat successful, but Antiochus IV actually died, of all places, in Iran, in Isfahan. And we've probably heard of Isfahan because it's one of the places where Iran has a nuclear facility. But that's where he died, around BC 164, at about the time when Jerusalem is freed. So the revolt began, and Antiochus IV commissioned Apollonius, a commander, who's stationed at Samaria, to set out to crush this rebellion. And they attacked Judas, but Apollonius was killed. Judas took hold of his sword, and the record says that he continued to use it from that time forth, the sword of Apollonius, against the Greeks. Now, just going to briefly go through, there was a series of battles. We're not having a test on this at the end of it, but it's just a little bit of interesting. So you'll find this in Modin. Here's Jerusalem. And they're up in the hills here. Apollonius slain, 167 BC. So that's the commander that Antiochus Epiphanes sent. 166, here's Modin. They try to come up through this way to attack at Beth Horon. Now we know something of the geography of Beth Horon, perhaps if we've done any work in Joshua, that there's Beth Horon the upper and Beth Horon the lower. It's like coming down Mengler's Hill, if you like. You're coming off a big range and right down to the lower country as it goes out to the lower Shephelah area. Of course, it's where Joshua caught up with the Canaanites in the battle as well. Another commander, Seron, he's defeated and flees. Okay, so if you can't get in that way, you go a bit further south. Here's Modin, here's Beth Horon. They come down here to Emmaus. Another one, 165 BC. What happened was in Jerusalem, there was Hellenizing Jews, but Judas and his armies basically blockaded them in. And so the Greeks were trying to release the Greeks in Jerusalem and the Greek sympathising Jews. It was just battle after battle after battle. The Battle of Beth Zur. Here's one last attempt. So here's Emmaus, Modin's up here, and they come right down to the south to try and come up into Jerusalem. Again, they're defeated, and Judas takes the Temple Mount and cleanses the temple. And now they have control of Jerusalem, and this is the area that the Maccabees had. By the way, they extended the Temple Mount. If you go to the temple, that famous picture you often see, from the Mount of Olives, you look there and Dome of the Rock and that wall along there. If you go along the wall, there's two features that Brother Lane Rittmeyer points out, and I've had a look at them. The bend and the seam. And one of them marks where the end of Solomon's Temple Mount was, and then it was extended by the Maccabees, and then it was extended by Herod. And you can actually see these, as it were, these historical time points in that retaining wall on the western side of the city. So after this, the temple was freed and cleansed and worship re-established. And they have a festival to commemorate that. It's called Hanukkah, to commemorate the 8 days of rededication of the temple. We find it recorded for us in John, when the Lord went to the temple at the Feast of Dedication, and it was to do with Hanukkah. And you have a Hanukkah candle lampstand with 8 lamps on it. Hanukkah was what, of course, was being celebrated by the Jews at Bondi at the end of last year when they were attacked. This was the festival that they were actually celebrating at Bondi. The Feast of Hanukkah. But at this time, Antiochus died hundreds, probably thousands of kilometres away, right over in Isfahan. And they now have self-determination. So some brief pointers here. After this time, Judas continues to campaign and relieve the Jews. It's the Battle of Beth Zachariah, where one of his brothers, Eleazar, is killed. There's a battle in 161 and Judas is slain. Down in BC 143, another of his brothers, Jonathan, is slain. He's captured by deceit and then slain. And then Simon is slain by his own son-in-law. So this is all the sons of Mattathias, the Maccabees. You see, verse 33, they that understand that among the people shall instruct many. And that's what the Maccabees wanted to do, was to have people who understand the worship of God. Yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by spoil many days. When they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. So they fall by sword, by flame, by captivity. One of them, I can't remember which one, I think it was Eleazar. One of them saw the king's commander was on an elephant, and so he got under the elephant and thrust up with a spear right through, well, endeavoured to, and of course the obvious happened and he died. He come down under an elephant. Interesting little historical things. In fact, one of the most fascinating, read to the children, one of the most fascinating stories I read was actually a book called The Maccabees. And it was one I got from my brother Jonathan Hill. And we read it aloud to the kids. It was really interesting history. It was fascinating record of what they did. But all the brothers perished in that struggle. And you see in verse 35, some of them understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even for the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. So in that struggle, there were people who understood. They understood the principles of God. They understood his law. But they still fell. They still suffered in that struggle. Why? Why did they suffer in that struggle? Well, it's trial, isn't it? And tribulation that comes upon each of us, because God has a longer view of things than we do. He is looking to the time of the end, to prepare them for the time of the end. I'd like to just come over to Hebrews for a moment. Hebrews chapter 12. In Hebrews chapter 12, and we'll pick it up from verse 5. Ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as unto children. My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth. Now that's pretty severe, isn't it? Scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. If you endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? Verse 11, now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. God's dealing with his sons. We deal with our own children, and no chastening for them seems for the moment to be joyous for them, does it? We've got some little ones here, and I'm sure that there's been some chastening that brings on some howls of protest. But we're dealing with them as sons. But it's grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them which are exercised thereby. Now, how are we exercised by those things? To bring forth a peaceable fruit of righteousness. Because chastening and trouble can bring in us bitterness, can't it? But if we can see that God has a purpose to the time of the end, his viewpoint is much larger than ours, then we can be exercised by it. But you will hear people that have perhaps been through great difficulties that become very bitter by it. But he says, be exercised by it. It yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness. Now, what can we do if somebody's in that situation? Well, verse 12. Wherefore, he says, this is what you can do if someone's in that situation. Lift up the hands which hang down and the feeble knees, and make straight paths for your feet, lest that which is lame be turned out of the way, but let it rather be healed. In other words, look out for our brethren and sisters and lift up the hands which hang down and the feeble knees. And you see, they were going through a very difficult trial at this time, weren't they, in the time of the Maccabees? But it was a preparation for the time of the end, a preparation for a time appointed. Well, it was a remarkable thing. It says they were holpen with a little help, and a little help from the divine hand goes a long way. Here's the Maccabee genealogy again. Okay, we started with Mattathias. Okay, and these are the years in which they died. Okay, 166 BC, Judas, Simon, Jonathan, Eleazar, John, and then the generations goes right down. They become the rulers right down to the time of our Lord Jesus Christ. And Herod the Great married into the house of the Maccabees to give legitimacy to his throne. He married one Mariamne. Okay? Herod the Great. He wasn't one of the Maccabees, but he married into that family and took control of the kingdom at that time. And just to give you a bit of an idea, here's the map of the area they control. Now we think of the Jews they'd kicked the Greeks out. That's a large area. That's a lot bigger than Israel today. This is the area that was ruled over by the Hasmoneans. And they were rulers. They weren't kings in that sense, because really there was to be no more king until he came whose right it was. But they did rule over that time. And so that's the record of the Maccabees. It's a remarkable record. And now we move on in the next stage in the history of Israel. And so we find now, verse 36 to 39 becomes then the rise of the Roman power and development into religious power. Can you see how this is still the sort of similar structure to Daniel 2? So Daniel 2, you got Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. Okay? Then you go to Daniel 7, you got Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. Then we go to Daniel 8. We don't have Babylon because that's gone into the annals of history. But we've got Persia, Greece, Rome. And then we get chapter 11. The pattern is the same. And it always comes to the time of the end. So let's have a look at from verse 36. And the king shall do according to his will. Now, what king is that? Well, it doesn't say the king of the north anymore. Why is that? Well, the Seleucid, after Antiochus the fourth died, he had a couple of sons and a nephew, I think it was, that vied for control, but they did not last. That dynasty did not last. It came to its end shortly after that time. So the king of the north disappears out of the record for a time, till the time of the end, and then that which, God willing, we'll have a look at in our next class. And here's a king that does according to his will. Now that's a phrase that we've come across a couple of times in Daniel. In Daniel chapter 8, now let's just go back for a moment to Daniel chapter 8, because it gives us a bit of a clue. Okay? Here's the Persian ram, okay, and we're told that that's the case, and the king of Grecia, okay, remember this, the Persian ram pushing northward and westward, northward, southward, and then there's a goat with the horn, Alexander the Great, that comes from the west. This is a couple of years ago, so we're probably doing a refresher here, and collides with the goat. It's the defeat of the Persian Empire establishment. It says of the Persian Empire, chapter 8, verse 4, he did according to his will. When we come to chapter 11, verse 3, it also says, he is the king that will do according to his will. And in the context, it's Alexander the Great, the mighty king, whose kingdom is then divided into 4. They both do according to his will. Remember that? It was divided into 4, time of Alexander. And now we have another king that does according to his own will. In other words, he has absolute power. He can do what he wants in relation to the nation of Israel. So Persia controlled the nation of Israel. They did what they want. Greece under Alexander did. And now we find there's another power that does according to his will on its influence of Daniel's people. And this king does according to his will. Now, I want you to come with me now for back to Deuteronomy chapter 28. As in Deuteronomy chapter 28, we have recorded the blessings and then the cursings that would come upon Israel for disobedience. Deuteronomy chapter 28. And we'll perhaps pick it up for verse 45, just a couple of words there. Moreover, all these curses shall come upon thee and shall pursue thee and overtake thee till thou be destroyed. Then perhaps verse 47, because thou servest not Yahweh thy God with joyfulness and with gladness of heart for the abundance of all things. Therefore shalt thou serve thine enemies, which Yahweh shall send against thee, in hunger and in thirst and in nakedness and in want of all things, and he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck until he have destroyed thee. There's a clue, isn't it? Did anyone spot a clue in that verse? What was the clue? The identity. The yoke of iron. Okay. Yahweh shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as the eagle flieth, the banner of the Romans, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. Now, when you went to Babylon, they spoke Chaldean. Now, you'll know that if you've looked in Strong's, you'll see words in Chaldean and Hebrew. They're very similar, aren't they? Okay? But the Latin tongue was totally different. Verse 50, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the persons of the old, nor show favour to the young. And if you read on through the context, it talks about the siege that would come upon them, how they'd eat the fruit of their own body because of the distress of the siege. And we know that is a prophecy of AD 70. Now come with me then to Daniel chapter 8. Okay, so we've got a nation of fierce countenance, a tongue you don't understand, a yoke of iron. I think we've got some clues here, haven't we? Now, Daniel chapter 8, and we will look at verse 21, or perhaps 20, because that's this vision here, okay? So this is a little bit of revision. It tells us exactly who they are. Verse 20, the ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia, okay? It's the Persian Empire, pushing westward, putting pressure on Greece, you know, the Battle of Marathon, etc. The rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king, Alexander the Great. Now, he wasn't the first king of Greece, but he was the first king of the Greek Empire when it expanded, once it overflowed out of its borders. Now, that being broken, that is the horn, four stood up for it. Now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, four horns, four kingdoms shall stand up out of that nation, but not in his power. And that, of course, was the four generals and the four areas that they controlled out of Alexander's kingdom. And in the latter time of their kingdom, now these in Daniel 11 have basically faded out, but we've had these two, the king of the north and the king of the south, the latter time of their kingdom, when transgressors are come to a full, a king of fierce countenance, and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. Ah, that's the next power after the Greeks, which is Daniel chapter 2. It's Rome, isn't it? Okay, the king of fierce countenance, the nation of fierce countenance that comes against Israel. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice and destroy the mighty and the holy people. That's the effect he's having on Daniel's people. And through his policy also, verse 25, he shall cause craft or deceit or fraud to prosper in his hand. And he comes eventually to his end. But what of these Greeks? Okay, we might remember that story, that picture of the goat. The one horn was broken, four horns come up, and then there's another little horn pops out of one of them, which symbolises then the expansion of the Roman Empire, because the king here of Pergamum bequeathed his kingdom to the Romans, and they got a foothold. And from there, they spread and encompassed the Holy Land, down into Egypt, across, after the time of these generals. Okay. Now, where was the capital of the Roman Empire? Rome. It was indeed, initially. Where did it move to under Constantine? Constantinople. And you'll notice that Constantinople isn't a very long drive just up there. It's in the same area. And this became the headquarters of the Roman Empire. In fact, you can go there and there's a milestone. You can still see the ancient milestone. They've got it, you're just walking through the streets and there's a little thing that's the ancient milestone from the time back there. It was the point where they measured distances to everywhere in the Roman Empire. It was the centre of the Roman Empire. Later, about 1000 AD, of course, there was a split between east and west, as we have two legs in the image. But prior to that time, Constantinople was the capital of the Roman Empire. I want you to tuck that back in your mind, because that is the capital then of this little horn power that pops out of one of the four horns. Okay, now tuck that back in your mind, because we might need that next class, all right? Constantinople. It's the capital of the Roman Empire. Now let's come back to what's happening to Daniel's people. BC 63, down comes Pompey, besieges Jerusalem, and they come under the control of the Romans. And that was the situation, of course, when our Lord was born and taught. There was the Temple Mount, Tower of Antonia at the end of it, Roman guard up there keeping an eye on what's going on. When Paul was there, it was the Romans coming out of the Tower of Antonia. They were keeping an eye, they were keeping control. And some of the Roman governors were helpful and others weren't. And so we have now this king of fierce countenance. Let's just read through here and see if there's any words ring any bells. So let's come over to chapter 11. Sorry. Romans chapter 11, and we'll pick it up from verse 36. So the king, it's no longer the king of the north. It's the Roman king, we'll see, by the pattern that's followed through Daniel, shall do according to his will. So he has power over the land to do whatever he likes. And he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, every ale, every power, and shall speak marvellous things against the ale of ales, Elim, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. So he's there for a long time, okay, till the indignation. And he speaks and he sets himself up against God. Let's look what else happened. In fact, I'll bring up a couple of words of Brother Thomas, because this will help you where we're going. Exposition of Daniel. The prophecy concerning the king in the 8th chapter is evidently descriptive of the Latino-Greek power in its pagan constitution. So what he's saying, the Roman Greek, but particularly in the east, from Constantinople and east, known in history as the destroyer of Jerusalem, Judah, and the people of the holy ones, but with a hint of its future ecclesiastical peculiarity. In other words, it's got a religious flavour to it, because he caused craft and deceit to prosper. This appears, as appears from the testimony. So that was chapter 8. Now we're going on and we see it enlarges on this hint about the ecclesiastical nature. Back in chapter 7 of Daniel, we had the Western Roman Empire and how it affected the saints, the religious system, wore out the saints of Most High. Chapter 8 deals with the East, but it's got a hint of the religiousness, and this is where it comes now. Now let's have a little look at this. Let's read this through. Verse 37 of this king. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers. Nor the desire of women, nor any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honour the God of forces, or you might see guardians or protectors, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honour with gold and silver and precious stones and pleasant things. So this king doesn't regard the God of his fathers. In fact, he honours a God whose fathers didn't know. Now, what's that saying? He changes his religion. What happened to the Roman Empire AD 312, was it? Thanks, Paul. A changed religion. And they no longer the king, and it's not a particular person, but rather a role, a position, no longer regarded the God of his fathers. Prior to that, they were pagan. And so Constantine came in, and after that, they tried. Someone wanted to go back to paganism. There was Julian the Apostate. They had a bit of a struggle. But now the religion changes. Now, there's a couple of little clues here. Verse 37, so he doesn't regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women. Okay, tuck that one in the back of your head. For he shall magnify himself above all. Come with me to, in fact, time's getting away. I'll bring it, I'll put it straight on the screen. Here we go. 1 Timothy 4. I jumped 2 slides here, by the way, Marcus. Okay. Now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith. So originally it was rooted in the faith of the apostles. Giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron, forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from meats. Now these start to identify the religion of Rome, because these are features of the Roman Church, forbidding to marry. And so the God that he now is honouring is one his fathers didn't know. In fact, he's turned to Christianity, so-called. That's not, of course, the faith of the apostles of the first century. He turns then to Christianity. Let's have a look at another one, 2 Thessalonians 2. It talks about there's going to be a falling away, and the Greek word is the apostasy. And there's going to be a man of sin set up, and I was going to turn it up, but our time's getting away, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. See, this is the attitude of the king and the one who he now honours, you see. Verse 36, he magnifies himself above every god, speaks marvellous things against the God of gods. That's what the little horn does in chapter 7, isn't it? Which is a religious power. It's got a great mouth and it speaks things against God and persecutes the saints. So the little identifying details in here. And he now honours a God of protectors who his fathers knew not. And how does he honour them? With silver, with gold, silver, this is verse 38, precious stones and pleasant things. You know, they added more to the list. If you want to see the complete list, look in Revelation chapter 18. You'll find it there. Okay? You might want to note that. He honours it with gold and silver and precious stones, Revelation chapter 18. And then it just summarised pleasant things. Revelation keeps on going about, wood and ebony and all sorts of things. A whole list for a couple of verses. Thus shall he do, verse 39, in the most strongholds with a strange God. This is a strange God, this religious system, because it's different to the one that his fathers had. Whom he shall acknowledge, so he acknowledges this system, and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. Okay, so we got then the rise, not of the Roman military power, but of the religious system which the military power promotes. So, In studying the nature of the little horn power, which of course is out of chapter 8, the Roman power must not be regarded as purely civil and military. It is an ecclesiastical power per se. By the way, this is exposition of Daniel, Brother Thomas. It is both, but in describing it, two classes of administrators are personified. The one is the king, and the other is the god of guardians, whom his pagan predecessors knew not, and therefore a strange god. There's a change of religion, and both have control of that empire. Now let's see how history has been poured into this prophetical mould. God of guardians. Here they are, all around St. Peter's Basilica. The guardians all around the top. When you get people superstitious to feel afraid of those, they become cheap employees, don't they? They don't have any superannuation, but people keep in line because of saints and these guardians that they have over them. And he causes them to rule over many. Okay, I think Mum went there with Dad many years ago to that place. Pope was giving a talk at that time. Did he go over time, Mum? Did the Pope go over time? They visited a long time ago. But you'll notice all around the top, all these saints, all around the top, the guardians, the protected places. Okay, and this is what he does. Now let's have a look at the history. Back in 529 to 534, there was a man by the name of Justinian, and we heard of Justinian's Code. He compiled it in Latin, and what it did was to pronounce the primacy of the church and the power of the church. That wasn't strong enough. We go on a little bit later to this man here, Phocas. So Justinian decreed about the power of the church. I might have had a note on there. There you go. He made legislation about religion. Sorry, this is Justinian. I was looking for my notes and I couldn't see it. And he made it the state religion of the empire. A little later, there's an emperor called Phocas. Now, Phocas was a pretty underwhelming emperor as far as emperors go. He did a couple of things. He returned the Roman rulers to wearing beards. If you read the history of him, he's not remembered terribly well. He was involved in an uprising against the emperor. He was just a centurion. He used to bring all the complaints of the soldiers. I kind of think he was sort of a bit like a union rep of the day. And he rose up to be emperor. He was only there for 8 years. He didn't do anything really exciting except he declared the universal bishopric of the Pope from Rome. That the Pope in Rome is the bishop, full stop. He's the top guy. The Pope in Rome at that time was this Boniface. By the way, he was the 66th Pope. And he was only Pope for 9 months. And he declared that Rome was the head church of all the churches. He declared that the bishop in Rome was the universal bishop. He was the top dog. He was the top religious man. Everybody else was subservient. And Emperor Phocas supported his decree and gave him permission to convert the Pantheon, a place of lots of gods, into a church. He was only there for 9 months. And he changed history, him and Phocas, because now Rome was the universal church. You might say, well, how does that then affect... Sorry, I've gone right off my notes, but I need to come to an end. But how does that affect the Jews? Well, obviously, the effect on the Jews by the Roman Empire dominating their land, the time of Christ, that's seen, and then AD 70, the most horrific siege in history. Okay? The most horrific siege. Somewhat brought about by the Jews' rebellion against Rome, and then God brought that to a head, and he brought that terrible siege. That affected Daniel's people. the Jews came back to Jerusalem and re-established under Bar Kokhba, tried to re-establish themselves in about AD 132. And the Romans came again and destroyed them and sowed the city with salt. They changed the name of the city to, I think it's Aio Capitolina. They tried to wipe out any trace of Jewishness there. That's the effect they had on the people. What about the religion? The religion of the church, who saw that the Jews, they took umbrage with them for having killed their Messiah and kept that going after generation. They saw it that they called it deicide. They'd killed God because, of course, there's a confusion with the Trinity, isn't it? And so there's been this antipathy between the Jews and the Roman Catholic Church down throughout history. Now, there's some more so than others less so. But it's caused people to write books like this, The Vatican's Holocaust, pictures like this, the Pope with Hitler. That's how it affected the people of Israel. That's how it affected the people of Israel. And it was to go until we see in verse 36, till the indignation be accomplished. And what we see is the divine timetable in Daniel's last prophecy. Notice how many times it comes up. In the latter days, in the end of years, after certain years, at a time appointed. Right down to the time of the end. And the time of the end is the subject then of our next class, because God has all the historical timetable going according to his divine plan.
Thanks, Brother Marty, on behalf of us all for your work again this evening, and looking forward to the next class again. By way of announcements for next week, our brother Nick Baker continues his studies on Romans. Down to chair is Brother Pete Boone, and supper is with Sister Em Linky. If you'll rise, we'll just close in prayer. Great and almighty Heavenly Father, once again we approach before your throne of grace, realizing that you have blessed us with this evening. You've answered our prayers to allow us to meet together in safety, in peace, and to be able to learn from your word this evening. We're grateful for this opportunity. We're grateful for each other and our ecclesia that we have now at this time. And we also look forward to that future time when your Son will return. We realize that many things are happening in the earth round about us which point forward to that time, so may we be standing ready. May we be able to help each other to stand ready in that day as well. So, great God, we are also thankful for the supper that we're about to partake of. We realize that it is indeed you who provides all things for us, so may we be strengthened by it. May we also have safety as we travel home. We look forward to that day in Zion as we come into thee now through his name, Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.